The most powerful man in Chicago was on his knees on the 40th floor, one hand clawing at the edge of a wooden desk, the other clenched around his own bottle of pills. He had swallowed 2, then waited longer. And nothing happened at all. Beyond the glass wall stood 30 people on his payroll, an entire floor that existed for the sole purpose of making sure he never had to do anything himself. But that afternoon, the elevators were locked to the floor, the security doors had shifted into another mode, and not one of them could get through. The only other person in the room was a woman in the orange jacket of a delivery company, a handheld scanner still in her grip. She had stood at his desk 40 times in 2 years. 40 times he had signed. 40 times he had never once looked up. He did not know her name, but she knew what he was holding. When the pills spilled across the carpet, she looked down and understood immediately that they were not real because every morning, on the narrow counter of her own kitchen, she took a small knife and halved that very same tablet for her 6-year-old daughter. In her shoulder bag was an identical bottle, the real one. 3 pills left, and it was not meant for him. It was meant for a little girl waiting in line for a field trip bus at a school 12 miles away, a child who would need it before that bus pulled out this afternoon. The woman looked at the man on the floor, then down at her own hand, at the bottle she was holding. She had one breath in which to choose. No one in that building knew that a camera would record that single breath, and that days later it would be the only thing standing between her and a prison cell. And no one knew that the man who had switched those pills had been walking through that door every morning longer than the owner of the building himself, or that he was standing in the hallway at that very moment, only a few steps away, with the real bottle sitting quietly in his coat pocket. Before this story begins, I wish you health and peace. Where are you listening from? And has the sky gone dark where you are? Leave us a line. And if this story reaches you, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to walk with us through every story still ahead. That morning began like every other morning in Vaughn Tower, which meant it began with nothing at all. No knock at the door, no hurried footsteps, not a single sound to suggest that anything was about to happen. Emmett Vaughn sat behind the dark wooden desk on the 40th floor, his left hand resting flat on its surface, his right holding a pen whose cap he hadn't removed. In front of him stood a man who hadn't been invited to sit. The man oversaw a harbor on the south side of the city, had worked for the Vaughn family for many years, and during the past 3 months had taken a portion of the cargo that didn't belong to him, then entered it into the records as though nothing had ever left the warehouse. He knew Emmett knew. That was why he couldn't keep his hands still. Emmett didn't ask why. He didn't ask a single question. He opened the drawer on the right, took out a photograph, and placed it on the desk, turning it so the man across from him could see. In the photograph, a woman and 2 small children stood in front of a modest house with a white porch. The picture wasn't new, and it wasn't old. It was simply real. The other man looked down, and every trace of blood drained from his face in silence. He couldn't speak. He only stood there as his shoulders slowly lowered, like a rope whose far end had just been cut. Emmett didn't look at the photograph. He looked at the man. Then he opened the drawer a second time, removed a thick envelope, and pushed it across the desk until it touched the edge of the photograph and stopped. Inside was a one-way plane ticket and enough cash to begin another life somewhere else. The man didn't dare touch it at first. He stared at the envelope as though it were something that might bite his hand. And when Emmett finally spoke, his voice was no louder than the sound of a sheet of paper being turned to the next page. He said the flight left that evening, and that the man should take his whole family with him. That was all. No threat. Not a single word about what would happen if he stayed. But the other man understood perfectly, and that was what made it frightening. He picked up the envelope with both hands. Then he began to cry. Not the loud weeping of a man driven to the end of the road, but the quiet kind that comes when someone realizes he has been forgiven in a way he doesn't deserve. He said thank you. He said it twice. Emmett didn't answer. He simply capped the pen he still hadn't used and laid it parallel to the edge of the desk. The man walked out, and the door closed behind him so softly that it was almost soundless. Throughout the meeting, Warren Ashby had stood in the left corner of the room, beside the small table where the coffee pot rested. He filled a cup, set it on its saucer, carried it over, and placed it at Emmett's right hand at exactly the same distance as he did every day. He didn't look at the man who was crying. He didn't look at the photograph on the desk. He didn't say anything either, because in 30 years of serving this room, He had learned that mornings like this didn't need anyone to add another word. His hand was steady, and around his right wrist he wore a gold watch faded by time. He stepped back, folded his hands over his stomach, and waited. Emmett returned the photograph to the drawer. He did it without haste and without force, as though putting away a file whose matter had already been settled. Beyond the glass, the city spread out gray and silent, while the lake to the east lay motionless beneath a sunless sky. He didn't look outside. He drew his phone from the inside pocket of his coat, placed it on the desk, and for a moment his hand remained still upon it. Then he woke the screen. At the top of the voicemail list was a recording pinned there so it could never be pushed down, one that had remained in that place through 3 winters. He touched it. There was the sound of a car engine. There was the sound of a woman drawing in a breath, as though she were about to say something terribly difficult. She managed to say his name. Then Emmett's finger touched the screen, and everything went silent. He placed the phone face down on the desk. He lifted the cup of coffee Ashby had brought him, took one sip, and drew the first stack of files for the day toward himself. Outside, 30 people began an ordinary morning, and in the corner of the room, the man who had walked through this door every morning for 30 years quietly returned to the small table, poured the remaining coffee into a thermos, then glanced at the calendar hanging beside it, where that afternoon had already been marked with a brief line of writing that no one else in the building had noticed. A long way south of Vaughan Tower, in an old apartment building where the elevator only went as far as the 5th floor, and everyone had to climb the rest of the way on foot. Maren Cole's morning began with the sound of a kettle and a child dragging a chair. Her kitchen was so narrow that turning around was enough to brush against a cabinet, and the counter was less than 2 arm spans long, but she had grown so accustomed to the space that she never had to think about where she was standing. She took the medicine bottle from the top shelf, where she always kept it, shook exactly 1 pill into her palm, placed it on the small wooden cutting board, then picked up the table knife with the blue handle that she always used for this. The blade came down with a tiny click, and the pill split neatly in half. She did it while keeping her eyes on the dining table, where her daughter was sitting. Her hand knew the way without needing to be guided. Nell was 6 years old, with her hair tied crookedly to one side because she had done it herself, and that morning she was talking more than usual. She said the field trip that afternoon was going to the botanical garden, that her teacher had told each child to bring something to eat and share with the group, and that she had made her choice the night before. She raised the package of cookies above the table with both hands, the way someone might hold up a great prize, and announce that these had stars in the middle, so somebody would certainly want to trade for one. Maren asked what she planned to trade for. Nell thought about it very seriously, resting her chin in one hand, then said she didn't know yet, but she would trade wisely. Maren laughed, and the sound of her laughter seemed to make the cramped kitchen a little wider. She carried half the pill to the table and placed it beside the glass of milk, and Nell swallowed it the way a child does when she has done the same thing every day for as long as she can remember, without questions, without making a face, simply drinking it down and returning her attention to her cookies. Maren wrapped the other half in a small piece of paper and put it into the box for that evening. While Nell went to look for the yellow socks she insisted she had to wear because they matched the trip, Maren poured coffee into her travel mug and called the school. She asked about the emergency supply of medicine kept in the nurse's office, the supply she replaced on schedule and rarely had to think about. The person on the other end took a moment to check, then said the compartment was empty. The last pill had already been used, and the new prescription hadn't arrived in time. Maren stood still for a beat, her eyes resting on the bottle lying on the counter. Then she said she would bring a new bottle sometime that day. The person asked whether she could get there before the field trip, because the bus would be picking the children up in the schoolyard at the beginning of the afternoon. Maren said she would, her voice as calm as though she were confirming an order. She had a full shift ahead of her. Her route passed through downtown, and Nell's school sat some distance out of the way, but she had already calculated the detour in her head before ending the call. She picked up the medicine bottle, listened to the pills tap against one another inside, then placed it in the zippered compartment of the crossbody bag she carried to work every day. Nell came running out with one yellow sock already on and the other still clutched in her hand, and asked whether her mother would be coming to the school that afternoon. Maren said yes, she would stop by for a little while, and Nell let out a cheer before asking whether her mother wanted to try one of the cookies. Only one, because if she ate too many, there wouldn't be enough left to trade. Maren said she would only eat half, and Nell considered the condition with the solemn expression of someone negotiating a contract, then nodded her agreement. Mother and daughter shared the star-shaped cookie right there in the middle of the kitchen, standing, without a plate, while crumbs fell onto the counter beside the blue-handled knife that still lay there. On the walk to school, Nell held her mother's hand and kept talking about the botanical garden. She said she had heard there was a greenhouse so large that it was always warm inside even when the weather outside was cold, and that she planned to remember the names of every plant so she could come home and tell her mother about them. Marin said she very much wanted to hear. At the gate, Nell released her hand, ran a few steps, then turned back to wave, still holding the package of cookies tightly against her chest, as though it were something precious. Marin remained there until the child had disappeared completely behind the classroom door. Then she turned away, checked the zipper on her bag one more time, and walked quickly toward the small delivery truck waiting by the curb, beginning a day she believed would be exactly like every other day. The delivery company's dispatch station occupied a corrugated metal warehouse at the edge of the industrial district, where every morning began with the sound of the rolling doors being raised and the smell of cold cardboard. Marin arrived a little before roll call, as she always did, parked in her usual space, and went straight to the rows of sorting racks. Inside the warehouse, everyone stood in a loose circle around the metal table where the dispatcher read out the route assignments. Every person held a cup of coffee, and every person had heard this routine so many times that no one needed to listen closely anymore. But that morning, the order broke apart halfway through. When the dispatcher reached the northern downtown route, he stopped, looked down at the board, then raised his head and asked whether anyone had seen Doyle. No one answered. He called the name again, tapped his pen twice against the table, then said Doyle had sent a message the night before, saying he wouldn't be coming in. It had been only a few words, and he hadn't answered his phone since. Someone joked that maybe the man had won the lottery. Someone else said Doyle had always disappeared for a day or two, and then returned as though nothing had happened. The dispatcher didn't laugh with them. He crossed out a line on the board, then asked who would take Doyle's route for the day. No one liked that route. It cut straight through downtown during the busiest hours, stopped at buildings where security guards demanded a record of every item, and included several deliveries where a driver might wait a very long time just to obtain one signature. The circle fell silent in the particular way people do when they are waiting for someone else to speak first. Marin raised her hand. She didn't think much about it. Covering another shift paid extra, and although the additional amount wasn't large, it was enough to make her feel a little safer at the end of the month. She had learned long ago that it was the small amounts that kept everything standing. The dispatcher nodded, wrote her name over the line he had just crossed out, then told her to change the route code in the system. She went to the computer at the end of the sorting racks, scanned her employee card, selected Doyle's route from the list, and confirmed it. A brief message appeared on the screen stating that the route code had been transferred to the account currently on duty, the same message that appeared whenever someone covered another driver's shift, and Marin closed it without reading to the end. She had seen those words dozens of times during the past 2 years. They sat there among hundreds of other notifications that no one in that warehouse had ever stopped to think about. Then she went to the loading area, pushed a cart along the racks, and began arranging the packages according to the order of the delivery stops. When she reached the items near the end of the route, the dispatcher called her back and handed her something that had been placed separately in the priority tray. It was a stiff, sealed envelope, neither thick nor heavy, with a label requiring the recipient to sign for it in person. The name printed in bold letters was Emmett Vaughn. The dispatcher said it couldn't be given to the receptionist, couldn't be left at the front desk, couldn't be signed for by anyone else, and had to be delivered before the end of the afternoon. He added that the people at that building were difficult, so if security gave her any trouble, she should call the station. Marin took the envelope, checked the label once more to be certain, then placed it in the uppermost section of the cargo compartment, where she kept the items that needed to be removed last. She had been to Vaughn Tower many times during her 2 years on the job, often enough to remember the way through the lobby, the delivery parking area, and the fact that the service elevator was located in the back on the left and always moved more slowly than the main elevators. She also remembered the room on the 40th floor, the dark wooden desk, and the man seated behind it who always signed his name without looking up. But none of that mattered to her. That morning, only 2 things mattered. She had to finish the route on time, and she had to stop by the school before the field trip bus pulled away. She checked the zippered compartment of her crossbody bag again, heard the medicine bottle tap softly against the inside, then pulled the cargo door shut. Outside the warehouse, the sky was still gray and sunless. Marin climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and joined the stream of traffic moving toward downtown. In the route ledger left on the dispatch table, her name appeared on the line where another name had just been crossed out, and no one in the warehouse looked at it again. On the 39th floor of Vaughn Tower, there was a small room with no name on the door, where Warren Ashby kept his desk, and where every document requiring the Chief of Staff's signature passed before it reached anyone else. That morning, after carrying the coffee pot downstairs and washing each cup as he always did, he sat at his desk and pulled the day's operational files toward him. He turned through the pages in their proper order, signed where signatures were required, stamped the date where dates were needed, and gave no page more time than another. When he reached the 4th sheet, he stopped. It was a system incident drill authorization, the sort of paperwork the technical department sent upstairs once every quarter, requesting permission to test the elevator floor lock mode and the switching function of the security doors. He had signed dozens of identical forms during the past 30 years. This time, in the box marked for the scheduled test, the line had already been filled in with the beginning of that afternoon. Ashby read it once, then read it again. He set down his pen, turned the page until it sat square with the edge of the desk, then picked up the pen and signed. His signature was as steady as it had always been, without a single trembling stroke. He placed the page into the outgoing file clip, set the clip in the tray on his right, and remained still for a span of time, long enough for the clock on the wall to give several ticks that no one ordinarily noticed. Then he stood, straightened his collar, and stepped into the hallway. He knew Emmett Vaughn's schedule by heart. He knew that sometime in the middle of the morning, his employer would go downstairs to the conference room and remain there for no less than 40 minutes. He also knew that the staff member assigned to clean the office had already passed through the 40th floor early that morning and wouldn't return until the end of the day. He went upstairs by the stairwell instead of taking the elevator, and when he entered the hallway on the 40th floor, it was empty and quiet as a Sunday afternoon. The main office door wasn't locked. It had never been locked during business hours. Ashby pushed it open with 2 fingers, stepped inside, then closed it behind him until he heard the smallest click. The room remained exactly as it had been when he left. The coffee cup he had brought that morning was empty, resting on its saucer at the corner of the desk. The pen lay parallel to the edge, precisely where Emmett had placed it. Ashby walked around the dark wooden desk and stopped on the inner side, a place where he had never stood in 30 years except while cleaning. He looked down at the drawer on the right. He placed his hand on the handle and didn't pull it open immediately. His hand remained there, his fingers closed around the cold metal, while the gold watch on his right wrist caught a trace of gray light from the window. Outside, the city lay still beneath a sunless sky. Inside the room, there was no sound but his own breathing, slow and even, then slower still. He stood that way longer than necessary, far longer than anyone would stand merely to remove something or put something away. Then he pulled the drawer open. It slid smoothly and made no sound. He looked inside for a brief moment. His right hand reached in and did something neat, something requiring very little movement, and when he withdrew it, his fingers had closed around a small object. He didn't look at it. He pushed the drawer shut, slowly, until it settled fully into place, and no gap remained. He straightened the saucer so it aligned with the edge of the desk, returned the pen to its exact former position, and stepped away from the inner side of the desk. Then he reached into the inside pocket over the left side of his chest, dropped the object inside, and smoothed the front of his coat with the flat of his hand. He remained for one more beat in the empty room. Then he left, closing the door as softly as he had upon entering, and returned downstairs by the stairwell. On the 39th floor, he sat at his desk again, pulled the remaining files forward, and signed the 5th page. His signature was as steady as ever. On the wall behind him, the hanging calendar held one square marked with a brief, handwritten line, and not a single person who passed through that building stopped to look at it. Marin reached Vaughn Tower late in the afternoon, later than she had planned, because Doyle's route included 3 stops where she had been forced to wait a long time, and 1 delivery she had needed to attempt a second time. She parked in the receiving area behind the building, took the sealed envelope from the upper compartment, clipped the scanner into her hand, then walked around to the main lobby because this item couldn't be left at the rear desk. The security guard stopped her the moment she passed through the revolving door. He looked at her orange jacket, looked at the envelope, then said all deliveries had to be left with reception, and someone would bring them upstairs. Marin turned the envelope so he could see the label, pointed to the line requiring the recipient's personal signature, and said she wasn't permitted to give it to anyone else. The guard took the envelope, examined it, turned it over in his hands, then told her to wait. He pressed the internal phone, said something very brief, waited, then said something even shorter. Marin stood beside one of the stone columns in the lobby, holding the scanner in both hands against her stomach. She showed no impatience, but in her mind she was calculating the distance from there to the school and the time she had left. When the guard returned, he told her to follow him. He led her to the service elevator in the back on the left, swiped his card, pressed the button for the floor, then rode up with her. Neither of them spoke along the way. The doors opened on the 40th floor, where the thick carpeting swallowed every footstep, and the guard led her to a wooden door and knocked twice. A voice answered from inside, low and concise. The guard opened the door, announced the name of the delivery company, then stepped back into the hallway to wait. Marin entered. The room was large and silent, and the man seated behind the dark wooden desk was halfway through writing a line on the file in front of him. She stopped several steps from the desk, in the same place where she had always stood during the past 2 years, and said she had an item that required his personal signature. He didn't answer. He extended his left hand, palm facing upward, without lifting his eyes from the page. Marin placed the envelope into that hand, then passed him the pen already secured in the slot of the scanner. He took it, placed the envelope at the corner of the desk, signed his name in the box on the small screen, and returned the pen. The entire exchange took less than half a minute. During that half minute, he didn't look up once. This was the 40th time. Marin had never counted, but had someone asked, she could have given the number without needing long to think, because there are things people never count, and somehow remember anyway. She stepped back, thanked him, then completed the final part of the procedure. The application required a photograph confirming delivery at the receiving location, so she took out her phone, raised it to chest level, and photographed the corner of the desk where the envelope was resting. She glanced at the screen to make sure the image wasn't blurred, saw that it was clear, then pressed send. A green check mark appeared in the application. She slipped the phone into the pocket of her jacket and turned to leave. The door closed behind her, and the guard escorted her back to the elevator. He swiped his card, pressed the button, and nothing happened. He pressed it again. The floor indicator didn't light up. He frowned, tapped one finger against the control panel, then took out his radio and asked what was happening downstairs. Static crackled, followed by a voice saying the system was in drill mode. The elevators had been locked by floor, and the security doors had switched operating modes. It would only be a little while longer. The guard let out an irritated breath and told Marin that they did this once every quarter, and somehow it always happened at the exact moment someone needed to leave. Marin nodded. She looked through the window at the end of the hallway, where the city had begun to settle into the dull light of late afternoon, and in her mind the route to the school was calculated all over again. The guard told her to wait there while he went down the stairs and found out exactly what was going on. He disappeared toward the end of the hallway, the emergency exit door closing behind him, and Marin was left alone on the 40th floor, holding the scanner in one hand, her eyes still fixed on the motionless elevator doors. After the door closed, Emmett Vaughn finished the line he had been writing and set down his pen, then did what he always did at this point in every afternoon, without needing anyone to remind him. He pulled open the drawer on the right, took out the medicine bottle, twisted off the cap, shook 2 pills into his palm, and swallowed them with the last sip of water in his glass. He had done it so many times that it no longer felt like an action, only another rhythm in the day, like capping a pen or straightening the edge of a file. He placed the bottle at the corner of the desk, drew the next set of documents toward him, and began to read. He waited. He wasn't conscious of waiting, because in 20 years, it had never made him wait. It had simply arrived, quietly, and everything had continued. But this time, it didn't come. He turned to the second page and realized he had read the same 3 lines all at once without understanding any of them. There was a faint sensation at the back of his neck, like a door somewhere in the building had just opened in a place he couldn't see. He turned back to the previous page, began again from the top, and this time, the words remained still on the paper, but refused to join together into meaning. He lifted his eyes toward the window. The city was still there, gray and mute. He placed one hand on the desk and noticed that his palm was damp, and that seemed strange to him because the room wasn't warm at all. He reached for the medicine bottle, opened it, shook out 2 more pills, and looked at them lying in his palm. They were white and round, exactly as they had always been. He swallowed them. He sat upright, both hands resting flat on the desk, and continued to wait. There was something deeply strange about sitting still and waiting for his own body to answer him. All his life, he had been accustomed to everything answering. People answered when he called. Doors opened when he arrived. Numbers changed direction when he wanted them to. Yet now he sat there, on the highest floor money could buy, and the one thing he needed refused to come. Then it began to drain away. Not painfully, not violently, but simply draining away. The weight in his arms disappeared first, and he knew they were still resting on the desk only because his eyes could see them there. He tried to push his chair backward, and the chair moved, but when he rose, the floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath him, just enough that he had to brace one hand against the edge of the wooden desk. He remained that way, bent forward, listening to the sound of his own breathing, far too loud for the room. He reached toward the internal phone. He could see it clearly, less than an arm's length away, with the gray button that would connect him directly to the secretary's desk. His hand stretched toward it and slipped from the edge of the desk. The medicine bottle rolled onto the carpet, and the white pills spilled out, scattering in several directions. He dropped to his knees. In that moment, a perfectly lucid thought passed through his mind, so lucid it was almost absurd, that beyond the glass doors was an entire floor filled with people whose salaries he paid, and he couldn't make a single one of them hear him. He had built precisely this kind of silence. He had paid for it year after year. Then the light in the room began to contract from the edges toward the center, like a frame narrowing around him. Sound went first, receding into the distance before disappearing completely, leaving only a low hum somewhere behind his ears. He heard footsteps on the carpet. He couldn't tell which direction they were coming from. Someone knelt beside him, very close, and he caught the smell of cold cardboard and the outdoor air still clinging to the fabric of a coat. He tried to open his eyes. In the last small space of light that remained, he saw a hand reaching toward him, a woman's hand, wearing no ring, the nails cut short, with a thin callus at the base of the index finger. That hand was holding something. He couldn't see what it was. He didn't know whose hand it belonged to. Then the frame closed completely, and everything went black. The last thing to reach him wasn't an image but a sound, the wooden door flying open and striking the wall, followed by the thunder of many footsteps pouring into the room at once. The security room in Vaughn Tower was located on the first basement level, without a single window, and the light inside was the kind of steady white light that made it impossible to tell day from night. Maren Cole sat on one side of the long table, both hands resting on its surface, her orange jacket still on, because no one had told her to take it off. Across from her sat Hollis Grant, the head of security, a man with the calm manner of someone who had spent too much of his life watching screens and had learned not to believe anything that didn't appear on one of them. He didn't shout, didn't threaten her, and didn't pace around the table. He simply placed 3 things in front of her, one after another, the way a man might lay down cards. The first was a clear plastic evidence bag with a label attached, and inside it was her medicine bottle, the bottle she had taken from the zippered compartment of her crossbody bag. He said it had been found on the carpet, less than an arm's length from the man lying on the floor, with the cap open and fewer pills inside than there should have been. The second was a printed record of the door scans on the 40th floor that afternoon. He turned the page toward her and pointed to a single highlighted line. During that entire span of time, the main office door had been opened from the outside exactly once, and she had been the one who opened it. No one had entered before her. No one had entered after her until security rushed in. The third was a bank statement. He placed it down more slowly than the other 2, and let it remain there for a while before he spoke. Several days earlier, a large sum of money had been transferred into her account, more than her total income over many months combined, sent by a company that had only recently been registered, had no physical address, and had no transaction history apart from that single payment. He asked how she explained the money. Maren looked at the page. She looked at it for a long time, and there was nothing in her face that resembled the fear Hollis was accustomed to seeing in the people who sat in that chair. There was only confusion, pure and shallow, the confusion of someone being shown words written in a language she had never learned. She said she had never seen that money, that she didn't know the name of the company, and that if she had that much money in her account, she wouldn't have raised her hand to cover another driver's route that morning. Hollis wrote a brief line in his notebook. He asked again why she had been carrying that medicine. She said she always carried it. He asked why she had given it to a man she didn't know. She remained silent for a moment, then said he had needed it. Hollis waited for her to say more. She didn't. She didn't tell him about the knife on the kitchen counter, didn't tell him about the half pill wrapped in a small piece of paper, and didn't say a single word about recognizing that the pill on the carpet wasn't real medicine. She had learned very early that once people had decided to see you in a certain way, the more you said, the more it sounded as though you were inventing something. So she said only one thing, and she repeated it 3 times during the next half hour, in the same voice, neither louder nor more unsteady. She asked to make one call to her daughter's school. The first time, Hollis said it wasn't the right moment. The second time, he said all outside communication was being held until further instructions. The third time, she made it clear that she wasn't asking to call a lawyer, wasn't asking to call a family member, and only wanted to call the nurse's office at a school, a call that would take less than a minute. Hollis looked at her, and for one very brief moment, something passed through his eyes. Then he said no. He closed the notebook, stood, motioned to the person waiting by the door, and stepped into the hallway. Marin didn't rise after him. She didn't strike the table, didn't cry, and didn't call out for him to come back. She remained seated beneath that white light that gave no sign of day or night, both hands still resting on the table, staring at the wall in front of her as though, if she looked at it long enough, the wall itself might tell her what time it was now. 3 floors above, in a room prepared for him in the building's private medical unit, Emmett Vaughn opened his eyes. The ceiling was white. A machine counted out a steady rhythm beside his left ear. Someone was speaking quietly in the corner of the room. He lay still for a while, gathering together the pieces of what had just happened to him, and the first thing to return wasn't fear, but anger. He didn't ask how long he had been lying there. He didn't ask who had brought him down. He didn't ask what remained of his body. When Hollis Grant entered the room, Emmett turned his head toward him, and the first sentence he spoke after regaining consciousness came out in a voice so hoarse it was barely a voice at all, yet every word was clear. He said that woman wasn't to set 1 foot outside this building. Hollis Grant stepped out of the security room and remained in the basement corridor longer than he had intended. He had been doing this work long enough to know that the 3 things he had just laid out on the table formed a complete case, and he had also been doing it long enough to know that the person sitting across from him had asked for something no guilty person would have asked for. He took out his phone, called the logistics department, and gave a very brief instruction. Half an hour later, one of his men carried a new bottle of medicine from the nearest pharmacy, along with copies of the necessary documents, climbed into a dark-colored car on the 2nd basement level, and left the building through the west exit. Hollis told no one that he had sent the man. He simply returned to the bank of monitors and opened the communication channel. The car had gone only a few blocks when the driver reported that another vehicle was following him, maintaining the same distance through 3 turns. Hollis told him to change direction. The other car changed with him. Hollis instructed him to enter the underground parking garage beneath an office building on the west side, leave through the pedestrian exit, and continue in another vehicle. It was the right decision, but it came 1 beat later than the men following him. By the time the dark-colored car reached the 2nd parking level, murky yellow ceiling lights were shining down over rows of concrete pillars, and at the final turn, another vehicle was already stopped sideways across the lane, blocking the way, its doors standing open. The sound of brakes struck the concrete walls and then died away. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle, blocking the lane. Hollis's driver managed to shift into reverse and speak 4 words into his radio before the passenger door was pulled open. No one said a single thing. The struggle unfolded through movement rather than words. There was the sound of fabric scraping against fabric, the thud of an elbow striking the frame of the car door, and shoes sliding across the dust-coated concrete floor. Hollis's man held the bag with both hands and turned his back to keep it beyond their reach. The bag was yanked once, then twice, before the strap tore. The documents inside flew out and skidded across the concrete. One of the 2 men bent to seize the object rolling away, and at that exact moment tires shrieked at the top of the ramp behind them. Headlights swept across the rows of pillars, and 3 security vehicles descended into the parking level at once. Hollis Grant stepped out of the first car. He didn't draw anything from beneath his coat. He simply walked straight toward them, and something in the way he moved made the 2 men understand that their time had run out. One of them fled toward the pedestrian exit and was stopped at the foot of the stairs. The other released his grip, stepped back twice, and stood still. The entire thing ended in less time than it took someone to prepare a cup of coffee. Hollis bent down, picked up the medicine bottle from the concrete, brushed the dust from the cap with his thumb, and looked at it resting in his palm. He thought about the 3 sheets of paper he had laid out on the long table in the basement, and about the woman who had sat silently behind them, without asking for anything except a telephone call that would take less than a minute. Then he thought about a question he didn't want to consider. The question of why. If that woman truly was the person the evidence claimed she was, anyone would want to stop a bottle of medicine from leaving the building. He slipped the bottle into the inside pocket of his coat, ordered his men to take the 2 attackers upstairs, and drove the remaining car north himself. He arrived while there was still daylight. He handed the medicine and the documents to the person in charge of the school nurse's office at the rear entrance, signed the delivery record with his real name, then returned to his car and sat parked across the street without starting the engine. In the front courtyard, a yellow school bus had pulled close to the curb with its doors open, and a long line of children was climbing aboard one by one. They were noisy in the unmistakable way children are noisy, all of them speaking at once, every one of them wanting a seat beside a window. Among them was a little girl with her hair tied crookedly to one side, yellow socks on her feet, and a package of cookies held against her chest with both hands, as though it were the most precious thing she had ever been trusted to carry. When her turn came, she climbed the steps, turned back to say something to the teacher standing below, then burst into laughter, and the teacher laughed with her. She found a seat beside the window, sat down, and raised one hand to wave outside, waving toward an empty schoolyard where no one stood, waving simply because today was a day worth waving at. The bus doors closed. The yellow bus pulled away from the curb and disappeared at the intersection, carrying the laughter of an entire bus full of children on their way to a great greenhouse where it was always warm inside, even when the weather outside was cold. Hollis Grant remained seated in his car until the bus had vanished completely. Then he started the engine and drove back to Vaughn Tower. News inside a building like Vaughn Tower didn't travel through words. It traveled through things smaller than words. A meeting rescheduled without explanation. An internal ambulance parked at the rear entrance instead of the front. A door on the 40th floor locked from the outside, something that had never happened during business hours. By the time darkness had fully settled, the entire building knew, though no one had spoken it aloud in a complete sentence, and that was precisely when Sutton Vaughn summoned everyone to the main conference room on the 38th floor. He arrived before the others, and was already seated at the head of the table when the first people entered, occupying the chair that, for all those years, had belonged to only one man. No one said anything about it. They came in, pulled out chairs, sat down, and the room slowly filled with a silence unlike the silence they knew. 30 people, department heads, senior approvers, managers of the shipping routes on the south side of the city, people who that very morning had risen from their seats whenever Emmett Vaughn passed them in the hallway. Sutton allowed the silence to linger a little longer before he began, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. He said his cousin was receiving care, that the situation remained uncertain, and that the most important thing now was that the organization couldn't be allowed to stand still. He said the market waited for no one, that partners waited for no one, and that if this position remained empty for even a few days, someone from the outside would move in to fill it. Then he turned to the part he had prepared more carefully than anything else. He said that beginning that night, every operating account would be placed under a dual approval system, and that the second signature would be his. He said all expenditures above the permitted limit would be suspended until the review was complete. He said every pending contract would be examined again from the beginning, because certain agreements had been signed during a period when the person signing them had no longer been in the best condition of his life. He delivered that sentence softly, placing no emphasis on any single word, yet everyone understood what it meant. He went on to say that everyone knew his cousin hadn't been the man he once was during the past 3 winters, that everyone had seen it, but no one had dared to say it, and that the time had come to speak the truth. He stopped there and looked around the table. That was the moment that belonged to the room. Every one of those 30 people had a reason to rise. The head of legal knew perfectly well that a change in approval authority like this required authorization from the board. The manager of the southern shipping routes had worked beside Emmett since the days when the organization hadn't possessed a tower to put its name on. The woman seated halfway down the table had kept her position because Emmett had refused to dismiss her during a season when her entire department was being cut apart. Everyone had a reason. No one stood. One person lowered his eyes to the papers before him. Another turned a pen slowly between his fingers and watched it rotate. Someone else faced the window, where the city burned with tens of thousands of lights, and remained that way until the meeting ended. That silence wasn't the silence of cowards. It was a profoundly human silence, the silence of people calculating how many working years they had left, how many payments still waited for them, and what one spoken word at that moment might cost. Sutton waited just long enough for everyone to feel the weight of that silence together. Then he nodded as though he had received their agreement and said he appreciated their understanding. The meeting ended in less than half an hour. People rose, closed their notebooks, and left, and no one stopped in the hallway to speak to anyone else, because by then even speaking together had become something that might be seen. That night, Vaughn Tower's internal system recorded a series of access changes made one after another within a very brief span of time. Every one of them was valid. Everyone bore a signature, and everyone followed proper procedure. And on the 39th floor, inside the small room with no name on its door, Warren Ashby sat at his desk beneath the light of a single lamp, both hands resting on the wooden surface, and didn't sign another sheet of paper until morning. Emmett Vaughn didn't sleep that night. He told the attendant to remove every line connected to his arm, and when they said it wasn't advisable yet, he only looked at them, and they removed them. He could walk on his own, slowly, with one hand moving along the hallway wall for support, and he went down to the security room on the first basement level in the internal elevator at an hour when only the night staff remained in the building. Hollis Grant rose when he saw him. Emmett asked no questions. He only said he wanted to review the footage from his office, and that he wanted to watch it alone. Hollis opened the folder, moved the timeline to the exact section that needed to be seen, placed the mouse on the desk, then stepped out and closed the door behind him. Emmett sat before the bank of monitors. He had occupied that chair several times in his life, but never to watch himself. On the screen, his office appeared from the upper left corner, tinted in shades of gray and without sound. He watched himself sitting behind the dark wooden desk, bent over the page. He watched himself open the drawer. He watched himself rise and fail to remain standing, saw himself brace one hand against the edge of the desk, saw the bottle roll from the desktop and the white dots scatter across the carpet, saw himself drop to his knees and then fall sideways. He watched the entire sequence without pausing once. And as he watched, he felt nothing, or at least none of what he had expected to feel. Then the office door opened on the screen, and a figure in a bright-colored jacket entered. Emmett moved the timeline back slightly and switched the footage to slow motion. He watched the woman run toward him, kneel at his side, and lower her face close to his. He watched her lift her head and call toward the door twice, then stop calling. He watched her pick up one of the white dots from the carpet, hold it close to her eyes, and turn it between two fingers. She held it that way longer than he had expected. Then she put it down, opened the zipper of her crossbody bag, and took out a bottle. Emmett reduced the speed to its slowest setting. From that point on, everything unfolded so slowly that even the smallest movement became clear. The woman opened the bottle. She poured its contents into her palm, and Emmett saw 3 pills resting there, no more than 3. She looked at them. Then she did something he had to replay 3 times before he understood it. She reached her other hand into the pocket of her jacket, took out her phone, and pressed the button that lit the screen. She didn't unlock it. She didn't call anyone. She only looked at the lock screen, and from the high camera angle, Emmett could see the wallpaper clearly enough for that brief moment, a photograph of a child laughing in the sunlight. She looked at it, then she placed the phone face down on the carpet. Then she turned back toward him. Emmett stopped the footage at that exact moment. He sat motionless before the frozen screen, both hands resting on the desk, and in that windowless room, the only sound was the low hum of the machine still running. He rewound it. He watched that same section again, then once more. The bottle. 3 pills. The screen lighting up. The photograph. Then the hand reaching forward. He had lived for 40 years in a world where everything had a price, and every action had a reason behind it, and he had become very skilled at finding that reason. He asked the questions the way he had always asked them. If this woman had been paid to kill him, then what was she doing here? If she had been paid to stage a rescue, then why stage it with something of her own, with a bottle holding only 3 pills, with that look at the photograph before making her decision? No one paid someone to perform a look like that. No one could perform a look like that. And the final question was the one he couldn't push aside, the one that returned every time he tried to rise from the chair. If she had wanted him dead, then why had she given him the thing she carried to keep her own child alive? Emmett remained there for a very long time. On the screen, The image was still frozen at the moment when the ringless hand reached forward. He had seen that hand once before, from the floor, in the last small space of light that remained. Now he was seeing it a second time, from above, clearly and beyond denial. He stood, turned off the screen, and walked to the door. In the hallway, he said only one sentence to Hollis Grant, that he wanted to go down to the woman now, and that no one was to come with him. The room at the end of the basement corridor contained only one table, 2 chairs, and a single ceiling light. And when Emmett Vaughn pushed open the door and stepped inside, Maren Cole was still sitting exactly where Hollis Grant had left her, many hours earlier. She looked up. She didn't rise. Nor did she lower her eyes in the way nearly everyone else in that building did whenever he entered a room. She simply looked at him, and there was no hatred in that gaze, no pleading either, only the flat exhaustion of someone who had been sitting too long in a place she wasn't permitted to leave. Emmett closed the door behind him. He walked to the chair across from her and sat down, more slowly than he wanted, keeping one hand on the edge of the table to steady himself. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he said he had watched the recording. Maren didn't answer. He continued, saying he wanted to hear her explain why she had done it. She remained silent for another moment, then answered him with a question of her own. She asked whether he knew how many times she had stood in front of his desk. Emmett didn't understand where the question was leading. He said he didn't know. She gave him the number. 40. She said that over the course of 2 years, she had stood exactly 3 steps from where he sat, 40 times. And all 40 times he had reached out to take the pen from her hand without once lifting his head. She didn't say it accusingly. She said it as though she were reading a line from a delivery log. Then she said the last part, that everyone in that building knew who he was, while he had never known her name, and now he was sitting there asking why she had saved him. Emmett Vaughn had sat across from many people in his life. He had heard people deny, cry, bargain, and threaten him in return. He had always possessed an answer for every kind. This time, he opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He sat there in a room lit by a single ceiling light, facing a woman in an orange jacket who had been held since the previous afternoon, and he couldn't find one word to say. At last, he asked her name. She looked at him. She didn't answer immediately. She allowed the question to remain between them long enough for both of them to hear how hollow it sounded when asked now, this late, in this place. Then she said she would answer when she was allowed to make one telephone call. Emmett asked who she wanted to call. She said the nurse's office at a school, and that she only needed to know one thing, whether the medicine had arrived. Emmett stood. He opened the door, called Hollis Grant inside, and asked him directly, in front of her, whether the medicine had been delivered. Hollis looked at him for a moment, then said he had taken it there himself the previous afternoon and had signed the delivery record. Maren said nothing. She merely closed her eyes for one brief moment, then opened them again, and the 2 hands resting on the table slowly released their grip on each other. That was all her body revealed. Emmett saw it, and something inside him shifted slightly. Not much, only enough for him to recognize that it had moved. He told Hollis to step into the hallway with him. Outside the door, he said the woman wasn't to be handed over to anyone, not the police, not the organization's attorneys, no one at all, until he said otherwise. Hollis objected. He said the 3 things on the table were independent of one another, that the medicine bottle, the door scan records, and the money couldn't all be coincidences at the same time, and that anyone who looked at the file would reach the same conclusion. He said keeping her there without turning her over was a risk the organization couldn't afford at that moment, especially when someone was already sitting in the vacant chair on the 38th floor. Emmett listened to everything. Then he said he didn't doubt that all 3 things were real. He said he only doubted the order in which they had been laid out. He said evidence never told the entire story. It only told whichever version was most convenient for the person who had arranged it. And in 30 years of doing business, he had been the one arranging things often enough to know how easy it was. Hollis fell silent. Emmett looked back through the narrow opening of the door at the woman still sitting beneath the ceiling light. And before walking away, he said one final thing. He wanted to know who had put the money into her account, and he wanted the answer before daylight. Before daylight, Hollis Grant brought up a stack of papers still warm with the smell of printer ink and placed them in front of Emmett Vaughn. He said the money trail was real, and that was exactly what had kept him from sleeping. The company that sent it had been registered only recently, had no physical address, and its entire file was nothing more than a shell, but it was a shell built by someone who knew how to build one, and people who knew how to build them always left behind a single trace: the fact that everything was too clean. Hollis followed the account used to pay the company's registration fees, and it led back to a name he didn't need to say aloud, because Emmett had already seen it on the page before Hollis could open his mouth. But the name wasn't what Hollis wanted to show him. He turned to the next page and pointed to the transfer order. The money had been divided into 2 payments. The first had gone out several days earlier, and it hadn't landed in Maren Cole's account. It had gone into the account of a man named Doyle, the driver assigned to the delivery company's northern downtown route, a man who had run that route for 4 years and knew exactly when Vaughn Tower was at its emptiest. Hollis said that on the night before everything happened, Doyle had withdrawn the entire amount in cash from 3 separate locations, sent the dispatch station a message of only a few words, saying he wouldn't be coming in, then turned off his phone and vanished beyond anyone's reach. Emmett asked why the man had run after taking the money. Hollis said he couldn't be certain, but people often ran at the exact moment they realized the task they had been hired to perform wasn't the task they had believed it was. Then he pointed to the second transfer. The remaining half of the payment had been scheduled to go through once the work was complete, and it hadn't been assigned to a person's name, but to a route code. Hollis explained that the delivery company used an internal system in which every payment connected to a route was attached to the employee code of whoever was actively running that route on a given day, rather than to a fixed account, because drivers covered one another's shifts constantly, and if the payments were tied to names, the delivery fees would end up everywhere they didn't belong. Whoever had constructed this money trail knew that. He didn't need to know who would be driving the route that day. He only needed to know that someone would. Emmett sat before the paper for a very long time. Then he asked Hollis who had taken Doyle's route that morning. Hollis said that at the dispatch station, when no one else wanted it, exactly 1 person had raised her hand. He added that covering the route paid a small amount extra, and that had been the whole reason. In that windowless room, Emmett Vaughn understood something he would return to many times in the years that followed. The woman sitting beneath the ceiling light at the end of the corridor hadn't fallen into this because she had done anything wrong. She had fallen into it because she had been the only person in that warehouse willing to take the work no one else wanted. The system that poured money into her account hadn't chosen her. It had merely found her there, because she was always there. Emmett pushed the paper aside and said that still wasn't enough, because the money trail proved only that she hadn't been the one hired. It didn't prove she hadn't been the one who acted. He needed something that showed who had touched his drawer. Hollis said the camera inside the office had been disabled during the system drill, and there wasn't a single angle that had recorded it. Emmett said then they would take everything that wasn't a camera. He ordered them to retrieve the complete delivery application record from the woman's route that day. Every action, every timestamp, every piece of information the system had recorded automatically, while no one was paying attention. Half an hour later, a blurry photograph appeared on the large screen in the security room, hastily taken, slightly crooked, exactly the kind of delivery confirmation image that millions of people submitted every day and no one ever looked at again. It was aimed toward the corner of the desk, where the sealed envelope was resting. Hollis was about to close it when Emmett told him to stop. He said that behind that corner of the desk was a glass wall. He told him to enlarge the section of glass. The image expanded, broke apart into grain, dark and noisy, and within the dull reflection of the glass wall appeared the hallway outside the office. A figure was standing just beyond the doorway, partially shadowed, watching the desk through the glass. Hollis raised the contrast 1 level, then another, and in that warped frame, one detail emerged more clearly than all the rest: a wrist, the right wrist resting against his coat, and around it a gold watch faded by time. Emmett said nothing. At the exact moment Maren had taken the photograph of the envelope, Warren Ashby had been standing in the hallway, only a few steps away, watching the room to see what would happen. He hadn't realized that the glass wall behind the desk would capture his reflection at that precise second. Emmett Vaughn rose from his chair. He stared at that wrist on the screen for a long time. Then he spoke the man's name once, very softly, and for the first time that night, his voice failed to remain even. Daylight had already come when Warren Ashby was brought to the 40th floor. He was still wearing the same suit he wore every day, still straightened his collar before entering, and stepped into the room with the same measured gait he had used to cross that doorway for 30 years. Emmett Vaughn sat behind the dark wooden desk. He didn't invite Ashby to sit. He didn't ask a single question. He only looked at him. It wasn't an angry look, nor was it cold in the way people might have imagined. It simply didn't move away. It remained there, resting on the face of the man standing before the desk, demanding nothing at all. Ashby endured that gaze for a while. He stood upright, both arms hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed on some point along the wall behind Emmett. Then his shoulders began to sink, very slowly, little by little, as though something inside him were gradually growing too tired to remain standing. When he opened his mouth, the sound that came out didn't resemble his own voice. He said he knew what his employer had seen. Emmett didn't answer. Ashby reached into the inside pocket over the left side of his chest. He did it slowly, and when he withdrew his hand, there was a bottle resting in his palm. He placed it on the dark wooden desk, pushed it gently forward, then pulled his hand away. The bottle lay there, intact and unopened, and there wasn't a sound in the room. Ashby said it had remained in his coat pocket throughout that entire afternoon. He said he hadn't kept it for his own protection, nor because he had forgotten to throw it away. He had kept it because even then, he still hadn't known what he was going to do. Then he spoke aloud the thing he had told no one during the whole of the previous night in the room on the 39th floor. He said that all afternoon, he had stood in the hallway not to keep watch, and not to listen for what might happen. He had stood there waiting to see whether he could bring himself to open the door. He said he had counted every step from where he stood to the door handle, counted them over and over, and there were only 4 steps, yet he hadn't been able to take even one. He said he had remained there until he heard someone running across the carpet, and then he knew another person had gone inside, and the first thought that passed through his mind wasn't fear. It was relief, because someone else had made the decision for him. Emmett still said nothing. Ashby looked down at the bottle on the desk. He said he had heard everything that happened in the basement, heard about the 3 sheets of paper, heard about the woman in the orange jacket. He said he knew what she had carried in her bag, knew how many pills remained in that bottle, knew who they were meant for. Then he spoke the sentence Emmett would hear again in his mind many times afterward. He said she had only 1 bottle, and she had given it away. He said he had only 1 bottle too, and he had kept it in his coat pocket. He said that was the entire difference between 2 human beings, and that 30 years spent standing in this room had failed to teach him what that woman had known without anyone ever needing to teach her. Ashby stopped. His hands began to tremble, and he clasped them together in front of his stomach in the exact posture he always used while waiting for his employer's instructions. Then he said it hadn't been the first time. Emmett lifted his eyes. Ashby said that during that winter, he had stood the same way one night in another place, outside, not far from a car. He said that night he had counted the steps too, had remained still, had waited to see whether he could make himself move, and once again, he hadn't. He said afterward he had done the things he was told to do, had done them neatly, and the following morning he had returned to this building, made coffee, carried it to the 40th floor, and placed it beside his employer's right hand at exactly the same distance as every other day. He said he had done that every morning for 3 winters. Something broke very quietly inside that room, and it made no sound at all. Emmett Vaughn remained still. He didn't ask anything more about that night. He couldn't ask yet. A thought was rising inside him, and he was using every bit of strength he had left to hold it down, because if he allowed it to surface now, he wouldn't be able to remain seated. He asked only one question, and his voice was very low. He asked who. Ashby closed his eyes. He stood that way for a while, and when he opened them again, tears were running down both sides of his face, moving silently, without a single sob. He said the man had come to him before that winter. He said the man had told him the organization was drifting toward an abyss, that his employer was no longer the man in command, and that someone would have to seize the wheel before everything went over the edge. Then Ashby spoke the name. He said it clearly and slowly, one word at a time, like a man finally setting down something he had carried on his back for far too long. He said the man was Sutton Vaughn. The name he had just spoken still seemed to hang in the room when Emmett asked the next question, and he asked it in the voice of a man who already knew the answer, but still needed to hear it with his own ears. He asked Ashby what he had cleaned up that winter night, around that car. Ashby didn't answer at once. He looked down at his hands. Then he said Marlowe had found the money trail. He said she had done it alone, quietly, over many months, following small expenditures no one had bothered to examine, until she had traced them all the way back to the name behind them. He said she had come to him first and asked him several questions, and that he had answered in ways that made her believe he was on her side. He said that was the worst thing he had ever done, worse than everything that came afterward. because it had made her believe she still had time. He said that night she had driven out to find her brother, and on the way, she had called. She called 3 times. No one answered any of them. Emmett sat perfectly still. Ashby said what happened after that hadn't been an accident, although everything in the file said it had been, and everything in the file said so because someone had arrived first and made it say so. He said he had been the one who arrived. He gave no further description. He only said that he had stood outside that night, not far from the car, counting his steps, and he hadn't moved. Then he had done the things he was told to do. He said that when morning came, he went home, changed his clothes, and came to this building to make coffee as though it were any other morning. Emmett Vaughn rose from his chair. He said nothing to Ashby. He didn't call anyone into the room. He simply walked out, moved along the thickly carpeted hallway where every footstep disappeared, and kept walking until he reached the small room behind the main office, the one with a single chair and a glass window overlooking the city. He sat down. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out his phone. He placed it face down on his lap and remained that way for a long time. Outside, morning had fully arrived, and the light spilled into the room in a pale shape across the floor. Then he turned the phone over, woke the screen, and opened the recording pinned at the top, the recording that had remained there through 3 winters, the one he had touched every morning and stopped before it could say anything to him. He pressed play. There was the sound of a car engine. There was wind slipping through a window that hadn't been closed all the way. There was the sound of his sister drawing in a breath, and then she said his name. This was the place where, for 3 winters, his finger had always touched the screen. This time, it didn't. Marlowe's voice continued. She said she knew he was busy, that she had already called twice, and that she would keep calling until he answered. She said there was something she had to tell him that night, something that couldn't wait until morning. She said she was sorry she hadn't told him sooner, because she had wanted to be certain first, and now she was certain. Her voice wasn't afraid. It was only tired, and there was something in it that sounded very much like pity, and only now did Emmett understand that she had been pitying him, not herself. She said he had trusted the wrong person, that he had been trusting the wrong person for a very long time, longer than he realized. Then she said she was going to speak the person's name right then, so that if anything happened, at least it would already have been said aloud. There was a very brief pause in the recording, just long enough to hear her swallow. Then she said the name. She said it clearly, without hesitation, 2 words. And inside the car that night, those 2 words sounded as ordinary as any other 2 words. After that, she said she was almost there, that she would wait for him downstairs, and that he could call her back whenever he was free. Then the recording ended. Emmett Vaughn sat in that small room with the phone in his hand, and he didn't move. He didn't cry aloud. He only sat there, his back bent forward, both elbows resting on his knees, and let out one long breath, the kind of breath a man releases after finally setting down something he has carried for 3 winters, without ever knowing he was carrying it. That name had been inside his coat pocket all that time. It had gone with him through every meeting, every flight. Every morning he sat behind the dark wooden desk and signed the papers that same man had brought upstairs. It had remained one touch of a finger away from his ear, and he hadn't listened because he had been afraid to hear her voice, and because he was afraid to hear her voice, he had failed to hear the thing she had died trying to tell him. He played the recording again from the beginning. He listened to all of it one more time. Then he stood, wiped his face with the palm of his hand, slipped the phone back into the inside pocket of his coat, and walked toward the door. Emmett Vaughn went down to the security room and told Hollis Grant that he needed one final thing. He wanted to know who had placed that system drill on the schedule. Hollis opened the system log and traced it backward. The registration form carried Warren Ashby's approval signature, which was nothing unusual, because every operational document passed across his desk. But approving a form and holding the authority to schedule it were 2 different things. Entering a specific time window into the system, locking the elevator floors, and changing the operating mode of the security doors required an access level that neither the chief of staff nor the vice president possessed. Hollis typed several more lines, then his hand stopped. He said nothing. Emmett looked at the screen. On the line identifying the person who had performed the scheduling action was the access code belonging to the head of security. There were only 2 men in the room, and the other one was standing less than an arm's length away. Emmett turned very slowly. He didn't say a word. Hollis Grant looked back at him, and there was no panic in his expression, only the exhaustion of a man who had finally heard something very heavy strike the ground. Then he said he had waited 3 winters for this moment, and that he hadn't known how it would come, but he had always known that it would. He opened the desk drawer, removed a small hard drive, and placed it in front of Emmett. He said he had been the one who entered the drill into the schedule, exactly as the system showed, but he had done it in response to a request forwarded from Ashby's desk, and he had done it because he needed to see what Ashby would do with that period of time. He said he had been watching the man for 3 winters. Emmett asked why. Hollis remained silent for a while. Then he said Marlo Vaughn had come to see him before everything happened. He said she had come alone, without an appointment, and she hadn't asked him to protect her. She had asked him for something else. She had told him that if anything happened to her, he mustn't trust the file, mustn't trust the conclusion, and mustn't tell anyone until he was certain. She left him everything she had uncovered up to that point, and asked him to keep going. Hollis said he had asked why she had chosen him. She answered that it was because he was the only person in the building who didn't owe anyone anything. Emmett looked at the hard drive resting on the desk. He asked why Hollis had said nothing to him throughout those 3 winters. Hollis didn't avoid the question. He said plainly that he hadn't been certain Emmett wasn't involved. He said he had considered that possibility very seriously, because she had died on the exact night she called her brother 3 times, and no one answered, and because in his profession, the person who failed to answer on a night like that was the first person who had to be examined. He said it had taken him a very long time to rule out that possibility, and by the time he did, he understood that speaking before he had enough evidence would only get both of them killed. So he waited. He recorded everything. He allowed every process to continue as it was supposed to, signed the proper papers, and kept the expression of a man who believed only what appeared on a screen. Emmett asked about the car in the underground parking garage. Hollis took out his phone, opened a message, and placed it on the desk. On the screen was a message from an unnamed number, received that afternoon, only 2 lines long, saying that someone would intercept the item being carried out of the building and giving the direction of travel. Hollis said he had traced the number during the night. It had been registered with old documents, had never been used for anything else, and had sent exactly 1 message during its entire existence. He spoke the name of the person who had sent it. Emmett showed no surprise. He only thought of the man sitting on the 40th floor with both hands clasped in front of his stomach, the man who had stood outside a door and counted 4 steps he couldn't bring himself to take, and he understood that some people lacked the courage to do the right thing at the decisive moment, yet still possessed enough of something to do it at the second moment, when it was already too late to redeem themselves, but not yet too late to save something else. He picked up the hard drive. He asked Hollis whether there was enough on it. Hollis said it contained everything except a confession, and that in a courtroom, a confession was the one thing no one could argue against. Emmett Vaughn placed the hard drive inside his coat, beside his phone, and said that in that case, they would go and get one. Throughout that entire day, Vaughn Tower heard exactly what Emmett wanted it to hear. People said the boss had grown weaker during the night. People said the private medical unit had called in additional staff. People said 2 departments had been told to prepare their files for transfer. None of the people passing those statements along knew that every one of them had come from the same place, or that Hollis Grant had released each one precisely where it would travel farthest. By the time the city lights came on, the message had reached the person it was meant to reach. Sutton Vaughn went up to the penthouse that same night. He came alone, carrying a document case, knocked twice, then pushed the door open without waiting. Only 1 lamp was burning in the corner of the room. Emmett sat in an armchair facing the glass window, a thin blanket draped across his lap, and he didn't turn when the door opened. Sutton placed the case on the low table in the middle of the room, pulled out a chair, and sat across from him, his voice immediately taking on the same gentle tone he had used in the conference room. He said he was very sorry to have to do this at a time like this. He said the board needed a letter of authorization, only temporarily, so that nothing would come to a stop. He opened the case, removed a stack of papers, and laid a pen on top. Emmett didn't pick it up. He asked Sutton 1 question, very quietly, where he had been on that winter night. Sutton's hand stopped. Then he laughed, a brief sound, and said he had wondered how long it would take for that question to arrive. And from that moment, he told him everything. He spoke like a man who had rehearsed the words many times in his mind, but had never before been allowed to say them aloud. He said Marlo had refused to stop, that he had given her more chances than she deserved, and that what happened that night had only been meant as a warning. He said he had approached Ashby beforehand because there was only one person in that building who was both close enough and soft enough. He said that this time he hadn't intended to leave any room for error, and that the previous afternoon should have ended cleanly if some delivery girl hadn't wandered into the exact room at the exact wrong moment. He said no one could account for every meaningless accident like that. Then he pushed the papers forward and told Emmett to sign them. Emmett Vaughn threw the thin blanket from his lap and stood. He stood straight, without trembling, without swaying, and in one brief moment, Sutton understood that nothing he had walked into was what he had believed it to be. He lunged forward to snatch up the papers. Emmett caught his wrist. A short struggle followed between two men who carried the same family name. The low table was knocked out of place. The document case slid to the floor, and in the movement, Sutton's coat fell open, revealing what he carried at his side. Emmett reached it first. He pulled the gun from Sutton's body and stepped back, and now he was the only man in the room holding it, while Sutton stood there with both hands empty. There was no one else in the room. Beyond the windows was the night, and 40 floors below them lay a city that had no idea what was happening. There were no cameras in that room. There wasn't a person alive who would ever question him. Emmett Vaughn stood there and felt all 3 winters gather inside his chest. Felt the weight of the thing in his hand. Felt how easy it would be. Then he heard his sister's voice. Not in his memory. Her voice was still there in the inside pocket over the left side of his chest, and he had listened to it twice that morning, and he knew exactly why she had driven into the night. She hadn't gone to expose a man. She had gone to pull her brother back from the thing he was slowly becoming. She had died on the way to do it. Emmett stepped toward the low table. He placed the gun on its surface, released it, and pushed it beyond the reach of both men. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out his phone, placed it on the table beside the gun, and pressed play. In the room lit by a single lamp in the corner, Sutton Vaughn's own voice began to speak, clear and deliberate, repeating every word he had confessed only minutes earlier. Sutton stood motionless. He looked at the phone, then at the gun lying untouched on the table, then at the cousin standing 3 steps away who made no move toward it again. Emmett walked past him, reached the door, and opened it. Hollis Grant had been waiting in the hallway for a long time, and behind him stood the people who had been waiting throughout the night. In the days that followed, Vaughn Tower changed in ways no one inside the building had been prepared for. Emmett Vaughn didn't surrender only one man. He surrendered everything. He ordered every record opened on the businesses his family had built in the shadows over 2 generations, the warehouses on the south side of the city, the names in the ledgers, the money routed through 7 layers of shell companies before returning as clean funds. For days at a time, he sat in a room with 4 bare walls and answered every question, including the ones no one required him to answer. The organization's attorneys told him he was dismantling with his own hands what his father had spent a lifetime building. Emmett said that was true. The empire collapsed in less than a season. Accounts were frozen, contracts were canceled, and the Vaughn name disappeared from the facades where it had once stood. Some of the people who had remained silent in the conference room that day were now forced to give statements, and others came forward without being compelled. Among the latter was one name that made the entire investigative division review the file twice. Warren Ashby asked to carry out all the evidence himself. He asked no one to seek leniency for him, bargained for nothing, and signed no agreement. When people asked why, he said he wasn't doing it to be forgiven, because he knew very well that what he had done was beyond anyone's forgiveness, including his own. He said he only wanted to do one right thing before everything came to an end. On the day he left the building for the final time, he stopped on the 39th floor, washed every cup in the small room with no name on its door, turned them upside down on the tray to dry, and only then walked away. No one came to see him off. As for Maren Cole, she left Vaughn Tower on the morning after the night in the penthouse. No one read her a formal apology. There were no papers and no procedures. Hollis Grant drove her home himself, and throughout the entire journey, he said only one thing, that he should have allowed her to make that call. She told him he had delivered the medicine, and to her, that mattered more than the call. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Emmett Vaughn came to find her. He came alone, without a driver and without anyone accompanying him, and waited outside the delivery company's dispatch station until Maren had finished her final route of the day. She saw him from a distance and showed no surprise. She walked over, stopped several steps away, still wearing the same orange jacket, and waited for him to speak. Emmett said he had come to apologize. He said he had looked at 3 sheets of paper on a table and believed them, that he had ordered her held before he had ever once looked at her face, and that while he kept her sitting in the basement, she had asked him for only one thing, and he had denied it. He offered no further explanation. He didn't tell her what he had done afterward, didn't mention any names, and didn't say a word about the price he had just paid. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a sheet of paper folded in half, and held it out to her. It was a check. The amount written on it was greater than everything Maren Cole would earn during the rest of her life combined. She opened it, looked at it, and kept looking for quite a while. Then she folded it again along the original crease and handed it back to him. Emmett didn't take it. He asked why. She said that if she accepted that piece of paper, then everything would become a transaction, and a transaction had a price, and that price would be her agreement that what she had done in that room could be reduced to a number. She said she didn't agree with that. She said she had done what she did not because of who he was, and she would have done exactly the same thing if the person lying on the floor that day had been the doorman. Then she said there were 2 things she would accept, and she stated them very clearly, like someone who had thought them through beforehand. The first was long-term assurance of her daughter's medicine. Not once, not for 1 year, but for as long as it was needed, written into proper legal documents, so that even if he disappeared, it would still remain. The second was a job, but it had to be work she could do on her own ability, with set hours, a salary, a supervisor who managed her the same way as anyone else, and no one at the workplace was to know why she had been brought there. She said she didn't want to be pitied. She wanted to be hired. Emmett nodded. He said he would do both. Then he remained there for a while and asked her one final question, whether she believed there might ever come a day when she could forgive him. Maren Cole looked at him. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no either. She only said she would think about it, then put the strap of her bag back over her shoulder and walked toward her vehicle. A few days later, while clearing out what remained in his old office, Emmett Vaughn opened a filing cabinet drawer he had never opened before. Inside was the paperwork for a support fund established in his sister's name. A small fund created for families with young children who needed to take medication regularly for many years, the kind of medicine insurance companies often refused to cover, and pharmacies frequently ran out of. Marlowe had established it before that winter. After she died, no one mentioned it again. Yet every year it was placed on his desk among hundreds of other expenses. And every year he approved it with his signature without once turning to the next page. This time, he turned it. The following page contained a list of the families receiving support from the fund, arranged in alphabetical order, with the child's name in the left column and the year the assistance began in the right. Emmett read from the top to the bottom. He read slowly, searching for nothing, and then he stopped at a line near the bottom of the page, the name of a little girl, the last name Cole. Beside it was a number showing that the family had been receiving help from the fund for 4 years. He sat for a very long time with the file open across his lap. For 3 winters, he had lived with the belief that he had failed to save anyone, that he had sat inside a building filled with people and still hadn't been able to protect the one person worth protecting. And yet, throughout all that time, once every year, with a stroke of a pen he placed on a page he never bothered to read, he had still been helping to ensure that a child on the south side of the city had enough medicine to take every day. That child grew older. Her mother went to work every morning, and on the afternoon when he fell to his knees on his own carpet, it was the medicine in that mother's bag that kept him alive. He didn't know what to call such a thing. He only sat there with one hand resting on the page, thinking that perhaps the kindness people offer without giving it another thought continues moving through the world, circling through years and through many lives, until one day it returns to the exact place where it began. One afternoon, not long afterward, Maren Cole stood outside the gate of a school on the south side of the city, waiting as she did every day. Nell came running out, her hair still tied crookedly to one side because she had done it herself, and the little girl jumped up to cling to her mother's arm before asking where she had gone several days earlier, when the neighbor had needed to pick her up. Maren bent down, straightened the strap of her daughter's backpack, and said she had gone to deliver a very important package. Nell asked how important it had been. Maren said it was the most important package she had ever delivered. The child nodded solemnly as though she understood, then immediately moved on to something else, explaining that during the field trip, there had been a plant inside the greenhouse, with leaves as large as an umbrella, and that she had traded her package of star-shaped cookies for an apple-filled pastry, and believed she had traded very wisely. Marin laughed. Mother and daughter walked along the sidewalk hand in hand, and the little girl knew nothing about what had happened, would never know anything about it, and that was exactly what her mother wanted. Across the street, Emmett Vaughn stood alone. There was no car waiting for him and no one accompanying him. He was simply a man standing on a sidewalk among other people. Marin saw him. She told her daughter to wait for her for a moment, then crossed the street. He said nothing about the fund, nothing about the name he had found on the list, and he never would. He only asked her one question, whether she would send him away if he came back there from time to time. Marin Cole looked at him for a while. Then she said she wouldn't. That was all she said. She promised nothing more, and she turned back toward her daughter, who was still waiting for her. Emmett stood watching them until they disappeared at the end of the block, and for the first time in 3 winters, he didn't turn his face away. This story leaves us with 3 very simple truths. First, no one is born invisible. People only become invisible when those around them are too unwilling to look. Second, the value of a human being isn't measured by how much they possess, but by what they are willing to give when there is very little left in their hands. And third, the kindness we offer today may travel a very long way, across many years, only to return at the exact moment we need it most. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video, so that every day we can continue discovering stories worth listening to together. How did the story of Marin and Emmett make you feel, and what choice would you have made inside that room? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.